Hello, and welcome back to our channel. In this video, I will explain how we perceive reality through our sensory organs and briefly describe how this process can be disturbed in mental health disorders. First, we need to understand the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation refers to the process by which our sense organs receive information from the environment. Humans have at least 5 sensory organs: eyes, ears, tongue, nose, and skin. These organs are involved in the detection of physical energy, like light, sound, or temperature, and its conversion into electrical signals. The signals are then sent to the brain, where they become consciously perceived as images, sounds, tastes, and so on. Perception is the process by which the brain selects, integrates, organizes, and interprets sensory information based on prior knowledge and expectations. For example, when looking at these pictures, at first, our eyes receive information about the colors, contours, and shapes of these objects. That is sensation. After having received the information, our brain then interprets it based on our previous knowledge, making us able to consciously recognize a zebra and octopus. That is perception. In some neurological and psychiatric disorders, sensation and perception may become significantly impaired, making it difficult to understand and interact with the environment in the appropriate way. Let's first look at the pathology of sensations. Pathology of sensations includes such symptoms as hyperesthesia, hypoesthesia, paresthesia, and synestopathy. Hyperesthesia is a condition characterized by an increased sensitivity to some sensory stimuli. It means that individuals may experience them more intensely than usual, which can become uncomfortable or even painful. For example, if you have sunburn, your skin in that area may become hypersensitive to touch. That is called hyperesthesia. The next symptom is hypoesthesia, which is the opposite of hyperesthesia. It is a condition characterized by decreased sensitivity to sensory stimulation. Individuals may not feel sensations as strongly as usual. A good example of hypoesthesia is reduced smell and taste in COVID or other respiratory viral infections. Another symptom is called paresthesia, which refers to abnormal sensations such as tingling, prickling, or burning on the surface of the body. These sensations are most commonly felt in the hands, feet, arms, or legs. Paresthesia may indicate that some parts of the peripheral or central nervous system are damaged, for example, due to spinal disc herniation or stroke. Finally, the last symptom is synestopathy, which is a term used to describe uncomfortable or unpleasant sensations such as tingling, burning, crawling, bulging, or other unusual sensations not on the surface, but inside the body. One of the main features of synestopathy is that such sensations are physiologically impossible. For example, itching inside the brain or feeling of cold liver are physiologically impossible because the brain and liver do not have receptors that could produce such sensations. Synestopathy is a relatively rare symptom, which is occasionally observed in patients with schizophrenia. So, these were the main symptoms of the pathology of sensations. The next group of symptoms represents disturbances of perception. Pathology of perception can be divided into 3 categories: psychosensory distortions, illusions, and hallucinations. Let's start with psychosensory distortions. In psychosensory distortions, the object itself is recognized correctly, but some of its features, such as size or color, are perceived in a twisted way. For example, visual objects may appear smaller or larger than they really are. Objects can also be perceived as closer or farther away. Distorted perception of time, such as the slowing of time or its acceleration, and a feeling of having already experienced the present situation, called déjà vu, can also be classified as psychosensory distortions. In addition, disturbances of the body image, when some body parts are perceived disproportionately larger or smaller, and disturbances of the self, such as fragmentation or doubling of the psychological self, can also be considered as psychosensory distortions. Such phenomena may be caused by intoxication, for example, intoxication with hallucinogenic drugs, or by different neurological conditions, such as stroke or Alice in Wonderland syndrome. However, some of them may be observed even in healthy people, for example, déjà vu. At this point, it should be noted that not only déjà vu but many other psychiatric symptoms can sometimes be observed in healthy people. In psychiatry, there is no clear-cut border between normal and pathological. The decision of whether it is a sign of a mental disorder or just a glitch in the nervous system depends on the degree and frequency of a particular phenomenon. Just like sneezing can be both a normal physiological reaction and a symptom of the flu, similarly, many psychiatric phenomena can be both normal reactions and symptoms of a mental disorder. You will see more examples of that as we continue. Let's move on to the second group of perceptive disorders, illusions. In illusions, not only some of its features, but the object as a whole is misperceived. For example, when instead of a pen, one sees, let's say, a knife, that is illusion. Illusions can be normal and pathological. For example, seeing water in a desert is a normal illusion. It occurs due to physical laws, not mental disease. Another example of normal illusions is the Ponzo illusion. As you can see, the line farther in the distance seems longer than the closer line, but these lines have the same length. That is a normal physiological illusion. Regarding pathological illusions, as the name suggests, they are usually observed in various pathological conditions. Pathological illusions can be divided into verbal, affective, and pareidolical. In verbal illusions, the real words in another person's speech are misperceived. For example, imagine two people talking about the weather. If instead of the weather you hear them talking about you, it means you are experiencing a verbal illusion. Verbal illusions may be found, for example, in paranoid personality disorder, delusional disorders, and schizophrenia. The next type of pathological illusion is called affective illusion. It may appear during extremely strong emotions, most commonly during fear. While experiencing extreme fear, a tree, for example, may be misperceived as a perpetrator or monster. Finally, the third type of pathological illusion is called pareidotic illusion. It is characterized by a misperception of visual patterns. For example, one might see a snake instead of a line on the carpet, or see a face instead of a pattern on a wallpaper. When static objects in paintings or photographs start moving or talking, these are also examples of pareidotic illusions. Importantly, when we perceive that something looks like something else, it is not a pathological illusion. For example, if a cloud looks like a face, but you are fully aware that it is a cloud, that's normal. But if instead of the cloud, you see a face and do not see the cloud, it is a pathological pareidotic illusion. Finally, the last group of disturbances of perception is called hallucinations. A hallucination is a false perception that occurs without real stimulation of the sensory organ. There are many types of hallucinations. Depending on their modality, they can be auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. So, each sensory organ has its own type of hallucination. Other types of hallucinations include hypnagogic hallucinations that appear during the transition from wakefulness to sleep, and hypnopompic hallucinations that happen during the transition from sleep to wakefulness. As you can see, there are many different forms of hallucinations. It is important to discriminate between them, because certain types of hallucinations may suggest a specific localization of a pathological process. For example, if it is a visual hallucination, then the pathological process might be localized in either peripheral or central parts of the visual system. Another example is olfactory hallucination, which is one of the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. There is another essential clinical feature of hallucinations that is very important to determine for diagnostical purposes. Hallucinations can be either true or false. True hallucinations are projected to the external environment. they are indistinguishable from reality. Therefore, a person experiencing a true hallucination behaves according to the hallucination. For example, when seeing a glass of water that is not there, a person might try to grab it. Or when hallucinating insects crawling on the floor, a person might try to crush them with their feet. So the hallmark of true hallucinations is their localization in the external environment. The exact mechanisms of true hallucinations are unknown, but in general, they can be explained by erroneous activation of cortical sensory centers due to pathological processes that change electrical activity in those centers. When we see objects with our eyes, normally what happens is that the light reflected from the objects transforms into electrical signals in the retina, which sends these electrical signals to the visual cortex of the brain, where visual perception is generated. The image we see is generated not in our eyes, but in the visual cortex of the brain. So, in true visual hallucinations, the visual cortex is activated not by real electrical signals from the retina. This can happen due to various reasons. For example, some parts of the visual pathway from the eye to the brain may be damaged by a tumor, infection, or intoxication. This damage may trigger erroneous electrical signals to the visual cortex without real stimulation of the retina from the external world. It can also happen due to sensory deprivation. When there is a complete absence of external stimulation, the visual cortex may activate spontaneously because excitability is one of the intrinsic features of the nervous tissue. For example, if someone puts you in a sensory deprivation tank where there is absolutely zero sensory stimulation from outside, soon you might start experiencing true hallucinations because sensory centers in your brain will start activating spontaneously, out of boredom, so to speak. Regarding false hallucinations, they are perceived inside of the mind, not in the external environment like true hallucinations. False hallucinations are similar to fantasizing or inner self-talk, but unlike these normal phenomena, they lack a sense of agency. It has been suggested that false hallucinations may develop as a result of an inability to realize that self-generated fantasies or inner speech are the products of one's own mental activity. For example, false auditory hallucinations, or the so-called voices, are probably patients' own thoughts that have lost their connection with the self and therefore become alien to the person. People experiencing false hallucinations often complain of someone forcefully inserting these voices or images into their heads. Mechanisms of false hallucinations are also poorly understood, but they are likely to be associated with working memory and attention disturbances. Working memory is a type of memory that temporarily holds a certain amount of information, allowing the brain to work with that information without losing track of what it is doing. It is akin to rapid access memory in smartphones or computers. And to understand how false hallucinations may appear, imagine that you had been watching YouTube videos for several hours in a row and then suddenly remembered that you have an exam tomorrow. In this situation, you might say to yourself in your head, "Stop wasting your time." We often talk to ourselves like that, which is normal. However, when we talk to ourselves, we know that it is our own self-generated inner voice. But how do we know it? We know it because the sequence of events that explains the appearance of our inner voice is stored in our working memory. The fact that you were watching YouTube for several hours, remembering about the exams, and the rest of the train of thoughts preceding and explaining why you are saying to yourself, "Stop wasting your time," is all stored in the working memory. That is why we know the inner voice is nothing more than our own self-generated voice. However, in some pathological conditions, such as schizophrenia, working memory can be significantly impaired. Due to glitches in working memory, people with schizophrenia sometimes may not recognize their own inner voice. That is why their inner voice transforms into auditory hallucinations. Working memory is associated with the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Therefore, pathological changes in the prefrontal cortex due to schizophrenia or other reasons, for example, substance abuse, head injury, brain infection, and others may lead to impairment of the working memory and consequent appearance of false hallucinations. In summary, sensation and perception are the first steps in our interaction with the external world. Through complex processes, our brain receives and makes sense of information from the environment. How we perceive this information is largely influenced by our prior knowledge, working memory, and other cognitive functions. In many neurological and mental disorders, these brain functions can be impaired, which may lead to incorrect perception of reality and create difficulties in interacting with the world appropriately. That's it for today. In the next video, I will talk about thinking and its disturbances. Thanks for watching. Take care and see you next time.